Coming soon. The Assassination, an investigation into a true story. A brand new podcast from the BBC World Service. Subscribe to The Assassination now and you'll get every episode automatically.
This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news, compiled in the early hours of the morning on Friday the 22nd of December. I'm Nick Miles with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, Catalonia goes to the polls again.
It really matters that young people nowadays vote. I think it's the most important just because it's our future.
What will the result mean for the region's hopes for independence? The UN General Assembly has voted to condemn President Trump's decision to recognise Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Washington issues veiled threats.
The United States will remember this day in which it was singled out for attack in the General Assembly for the very act of exercising our right as a sovereign nation.
And hear why the Peruvian president is fighting for his political life. But we begin in Catalonia, and one thing is clear in the region of northern Spain. The people there are becoming experts in going to the polls. They've been voting for a new parliament as the previous administration was dissolved by Madrid after it declared independence from Spain. In Barcelona, 18-year-old Laura said she was voting to show her support for the ousted Catalan leader Carles Puigdemont.
I'm feeling great and I'm feeling positive. It really matters that young people nowadays vote. I think it's the most important just because it's our future. He's actually 8 and I think that's not the way political should work. And I feel like he just needs my vote.
After casting her vote, the leader for the pro-unity Citizens Party, Inés Arrimadas, said her party was working hard for reconciliation and a good result was key to that.
I hope during these historic elections we can achieve historic participation. We are probably facing an election that's essential to our coexistence, essential to the reconciliation of all Catalans. I hope we flood the ballot boxes with votes and achieve a result that we'll remember for a long time.
At the time of recording this podcast, most of the votes have been counted and parties that favour independence from Spain are on track to maintain a majority in the region's parliament. Such a result would represent a major setback for the policies of the Spanish Prime Minister, Mariano Rajoy. Kevin Connolly is in Barcelona and I spoke to him as the votes were being counted.
What we're seeing so far is that the largest single party in the new Catalan parliament will be Ciudadanos. That is a unionist party, of course, that ran on maintaining the link with Spain. But if you add up the votes of the pro-independence parties and put them together, we think it's showing that they may have a 2-seat majority in the new parliament. That could still change. It's a wafer-thin margin, of course, to try to get anything done in Catalan politics. And in some ways, it's the most difficult result for the Spanish government to work with, because you have a unionist party as the largest single entity in the parliament, but as things stand at the moment, a small but clear majority for independence. The big question then, of course, becomes how does the government in Madrid try to manage this situation and try to stop a pro-independence majority in the Catalan parliament from pushing ahead with its project to try to break with Spain.
Indeed. I mean, you were mentioning the Ciudadanos there, the pro-Madrid party, looking like it's going to be the largest party. It has a chance to form a government a month. It's not likely to achieve that, though, is it?
No, I'm looking at the arithmetic of the new parliament. I don't see how a unionist government can be formed out of this result, even if Ciudadanos does clearly emerge as the largest single party. You can't beat the pro-independence arithmetic. The share of the vote may be very, very similar, but the breakdown of the vote between town and country, between Catalan speakers and Spanish speakers, that tends to favour the pro-independence parties. It does look as though they are going to have that small majority. The question is, how will they try to use it? Will they try to push for perhaps a referendum agreed with Madrid. I can't see Madrid agreeing to that. Will they simply aim more modestly to restore the powers of autonomy which they currently don't have in the Catalan parliament? There are lots of difficult questions for all of the parties here, but I think the hardest questions tonight are being asked of Madrid and of Mariano Rajoy. It was his decision to hold this election. He had hoped, and I think assumed perhaps, that a unionist majority would come out, and it looks as though that gamble has not paid off.
And very briefly, Kevin, what's your sense about the people who voted for the independence parties? What's their expectation? Now, what do they want?
In the long term, they still talk about independence. They know now that road is hard. They don't think Madrid will agree to a legally binding referendum. I think they will take things step by step. They will look to restore autonomy, and then they will look to the future.
Kevin Connolly in Barcelona. The United Nations General Assembly has passed a resolution condemning President Trump's decision to recognise Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The document, which is non-binding, was sponsored by Turkey and Yemen. The Turkish Foreign Minister is Mevlut Çavuşoğlu.
Today's vote is important to remind that the Palestinians are not alone. The recent decision of a UN member state to recognize Jerusalem or Al-Quds as the capital of Israel violates the international law, including all relevant UN resolutions. This decision is an outrageous assault to all universal values.
The American ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, said the resolution would not change her government's decision about Jerusalem.
The United States will remember this day in which it was singled out for attack in the General Assembly for the very act of exercising our right as a sovereign nation. We will remember it when we are called upon to once again make the world's largest contribution to the United Nations. And we will remember it when so many countries come calling on us, as they so often do, to pay even more and to use our influence for their benefit. America will put our embassy in Jerusalem. That is what the American people want us to do. And it is the right thing to do.
Our correspondent Neda Tawfik was at the UN and explains the vote results.
The overwhelming majority of the General Assembly voted in favor of this resolution, despite the threats from the United States. 128 countries voted in favor of the resolution. But what's interesting is the number that voted against and the number that abstained. So 9 countries voted against this, siding with the United States, mostly contained members of the Pacific Island nations, of course, Israel as well. And the number of abstentions, 35 countries abstained. Now, that included Mexico and Canada. And Canada in particular is interesting because when I spoke to a senior European diplomat, they said that Canada was going to vote against this resolution, but they were so angered by the tone of the United States' threats in recent days that they decided to abstain. And it's also worth pointing out that 21 countries didn't even show up to the vote. And so U.S. official speaking on background had said that this number was encouraging, that they saw that this meant that the U.S. did have some influence with this warning to countries that they would cut off funding for those that they support. It's worth pointing out, for example, Ukraine, even though they supported the Security Council resolution on Monday that failed because of the U.S. veto, they didn't even show up to this vote, and they just got an arms deal with the United States the other day.
So, Neda, very briefly, the United States is going to push ahead anyway. It's not going to backtrack over this, I imagine.
Well, Nikki Haley again emphasized in the General Assembly Hall that they would be looking at their contributions to the United Nations and those who ask for funding for anyone who did vote against them. So it's interesting because some diplomats here see that as political posturing, speaking to a domestic audience to show that Trump is taking a tough line on those who want to criticize Israel.
That was Neda Tawfik at the UN. Cuba's National Assembly has extended its current term by 2 months, paving the way for President Raul Castro to step down in April next year. The election to choose a new president takes place behind closed doors and has been rescheduled for the 19th of April, the anniversary of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion by American-backed Cuban exiles in 1961. Our correspondent Will Grant is in Havana.
The specific reason given for the delay has been the exceptional circumstances caused by Hurricane Irma, which tore along the northern coastline of Cuba, causing 10 deaths and millions of dollars worth of damage. The other exceptional circumstance, although one unlikely to be acknowledged in Parliament, is the arrival of Donald Trump to the White House and his more hostile approach towards Cuba. He has rolled back on his predecessor's policy of engagement with the island, and although this delay is considered purely procedural and temporary, there is a suggestion in some quarters that this isn't the ideal moment for Raul Castro to step down.
That was Will Grant. Venezuela is in a very difficult economic predicament, one of the world's worst. You might be familiar with the picture of people in towns and cities queuing for their food. In the countryside, life's no less of a struggle. The production of corn, a staple in Venezuela, has fallen 40% in the past year, one of many crops with falling yields. Our South America correspondent Katie Watson reports from the state of Portuguesa.
In Venezuela's breadbasket, farmers have their work cut out. Ronald Lacker has been on his family's small farm all his life, but he says he's never struggled so much. This year he didn't get fertiliser for his corn crop in time, so it's spoilt. And then, of course, there's the machinery.
We are doing this all on our own and trying to do our best, but the economic situation is really tough. It is not easy to produce in the fields of Venezuela. Last time we had new machinery here, it was 4 years ago. We need new machinery, but there's nothing available.
He has to sell his corn at subsidised prices because it's a staple. Ronald says he can only just keep the farm afloat. But his problems don't end there.
In the corner of the farmyard is a half-built house. It's got no windows, no doors, no roof, but it does have some very elegant pillars all the way around it. Now, this was meant to be built for Ronald's mother, but they stopped because they can't afford the cement. They can't get the cement because of the supplies and the problems here in Venezuela. So it's just been left derelict, and the only residents here are 4 sheep. Now, they used to have 16, they sold some, but others were stolen. People trying to get any food they can here in the country.
Just down the road, I meet Ramon Bolutin, a successful farmer who grows sunflowers. He's angry about what the government's done.
Venezuela used to produce 70% of its food. Now we import 70%. The government's monopolized the supply for the agriculture industry. The state is the only supplier now. The government never makes a good administrator, and this is no different.
It's not just farmers who are fed up, though. For everyone, life has changed. Luis Mendez sells corn patties known as arepas in his family cafe. Only he's noticed business slow right down. Buying corn has become harder and harder as inflation spiraled.
3 years ago, we sold 500 arepas every day. A year ago, that fell to 150. From the beginning of this year, we are talking 15, 20.
Cattle farmer Manuel Vicente Parra has had to cut the number of cattle he owns because of the crisis.
Meat for consumers is becoming rarer because it's expensive for the average person, but it's also expensive to produce. Production costs are high, supplies, machinery, vaccines. Inflation is strangling us. Our costs rise every day.
A few years back, he decided to start growing crops, but even then, that's not without its challenges. His corn crop was stolen by hungry villagers desperate for a meal, so he switched to soya. He's got one message for the government.
All we want to do as cattle farmers is produce. Those of us in the cattle business need the state and the state needs us. And the only way right now is to sit down and understand each other.
With production falling and the number of people going hungry on the rise, those conversations are needed more than ever.
That report by Katie Watson. You're listening to Global News, the most important stories and the best interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. And now Owen Bennett-Jones will tell you about another of our podcasts.
Our brand new podcast series, The Assassination, is about an unsolved murder with global ramifications. It's an investigation into the assassination of one of the world's most prominent politicians, Pakistan's Benazir Bhutto. Subscribe now and you won't miss episode 1. Search for The Assassination where you get your podcasts.
Coming up on the rest of this edition of the Global News Podcast. People across the Northern Hemisphere have been celebrating the winter solstice. We take a look at the celestial forces behind it. And the smash hit musical Hamilton hits London's West End. But now, as we record this podcast, the Peruvian Congress has been voting on whether to impeach the president, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski. He is accused of corruption, of having taken illicit payments from the Brazilian construction company Odebrecht. Monica de Bolli is a Latin America specialist at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in the US. She told Tim Franks about Mr. Kuczynski's position within Congress.
He's insistent that he's done nothing illegal. The problem for him, of course, is that he does not hold a majority in Congress. The majority is actually commanded, in a sense, by Keiko Fujimori, by his opponent. And this is where, things could potentially backfire for him.
And Mr. Fujimori himself, the former president, he's in prison.
Yes.
It's corruption allegations, isn't it?
It is corruption allegations.
Right. Well, indeed, a corruption conviction.
It doesn't necessarily involve Odebrecht.
But am I right in saying that Mr. Fujimori has been in touch with President Kuczynski to say, you may want to think about granting me a pardon?
Yes. All of these things are playing out in Peru right now, and it's a very muddled and complex situation because, as it happens, former President Fujimori is in jail due to corruption charges, and yes, he has asked to be pardoned. There are other former Peruvian presidents who are either in jail or being actively investigated under the corruption scandal out of Odebrecht.
Right.
Peru is the one country in Latin America that has, apart from Brazil, been most impacted by the Odebrecht scandal. So it's quite a wide-reaching problem in Peru.
Am I right in saying that Mr. Fujimori is making it very clear that if he were pardoned, that he'd call off the dogs in Congress and that in that way the current president would be able to escape the probability that he will end up being impeached?
Yes, he is trying to play that card very hard.
And in public, a clear equivalence here.
Yes, absolutely.
How's that going down in Peru?
Everybody is, of course, not only devastated, but absolutely indignant over this situation. The people in Peru in general were already pretty fed up with corruption. They elected Kuczynski because of his perception as a solid and clean public figure. And now there are these things tainting him. So obviously that, plus the play being made by former President Fujimori and all the articulations that are going on within the opposition, which, by the way, is led by Fujimori's daughter, none of this is playing well at all with public opinion in Peru.
I suppose the other thing to take out of this is just how far Odebrecht's power, some people might say tentacles, spread well beyond Brazil.
Well beyond Brazil. I mean, by all accounts, we now have evidence that Odebrecht's alleged corruption, kickback, bribes have affected at least a dozen countries in Latin America, and that includes not only countries in South America, so in Brazil's orbit, but also countries in the Caribbean, like the Dominican Republic, as well as countries in Central America, like Costa Rica and Mexico.
Is Odebrecht itself going through big changes in an attempt to clean up its image or indeed clean up its act?
Well, it has fired a lot of executives. There are about 70 plus or so, which are currently under active investigation by Brazilian authorities. So yes, there's been an effort to sort of clean the books, as it were. Odebrecht trying to stay away now, having gotten rid of these executives, trying to say that it's now a different company. But obviously, given the sheer size of this and the fact that it's been going on for so many years, will make it very hard for the company to reconstruct its image.
Monica De Bolli from the Peterson Institute for International Economics in the US. Ukraine is fighting an on-off civil war against separatists in the east of the country. Kiev says the rebels have the direct backing of Moscow, and that makes what's been going on in Ukraine on Thursday even more embarrassing. A Ukrainian official who worked as a senior government interpreter has been arrested and accused of spying for Russia. Jonah Fisher in Kiev told me more about him.
Well, his name is Stanislav Yezov. He was arrested on Wednesday evening at his office here in central Kiev, and his job was a senior interpreter for the Prime Minister of Ukraine, Mr. Groysman. He's travelled really all around the world with Mr. Groysman, taking part in pretty senior high-level meetings. And what has come out today in the statements that have been released by the SBU, which is the secret police here in Ukraine, is that they believe that for a period of time, a lengthy period of time, they're saying he's been effectively working for Russia, a Russian spy, a man who will have seen and heard a lot. And he was arrested last night. We're expecting him to be facing some sort of judicial process. He's likely to be charged with espionage. Some people are even suggesting he might end up being charged with treason.
What kind of meetings would he have attended?
You just have to go through the back catalogue of photos that have been released by the Ukrainian government over the last several years of important meetings which the Prime Minister has attended. So, for example, we looked at the Prime Minister's visit to the UK in July, and we saw pictures of Mr. Yezov walking down a corridor in Downing Street in between Theresa May and Vladimir Groysman. There's another picture of him sitting on the side translating during a meeting between Vladimir Groysman and Joe Biden when he was still Vice President of the United States. The reason why he's been attending so many of these meetings is because the English level of the Prime Minister here, Vladimir Groysman, isn't particularly good. So he's obviously been at a lot of meetings, heard a lot, seen a lot, and it's alleged has been reporting that back to Moscow.
I've seen one member of parliament, Anton Herashchenko, quoted as saying there are very many Russian agents at Ukrainian government bodies working for the Russian security agencies. What reason is there to believe that he's right?
Well, I think that's assumed to be correct, and I suppose one of the ironies of this is that the SBU itself is widely believed to be completely infiltrated by Russian agents. You know, you have to remember that this country is only in the last 4 years perhaps really tilted definitively towards the West, and there are still many people in government here who have quite a good deal of sympathy for the previous president here, President Viktor Yanukovych, who was much closer to Russia, and people who also just generally would prefer this country to be leaning a little bit more to the East and a bit less to the West.
Jonah Fisher. There have been plenty of people braving the elements in parts of the Northern Hemisphere on Thursday. At the Neolithic tomb of Newgrange in Ireland, they gathered at dawn to watch the first rays of sun creep over the horizon on the winter solstice, the Northern Hemisphere's shortest day of the year. In the Southern Hemisphere, it's the longest day. Why is there a solstice in the first place? Here is Sarah Keith-Lucas from BBC Weather.
It's all to do with the tilt of the Earth. So the Earth tilts on its own axis by a set amount, but it also tilts in relation to the sun. So at the winter solstice, that means the Northern Hemisphere is tilting furthest away from the sun. So anywhere north of the Arctic Circle during the solstice will get 24 hours of complete darkness. And of course, in the southern hemisphere, 24 hours of sunshine, or daylight at least, during the summer solstice.
Hence, it's an extremely significant time, as you say, particularly for those people north of the Arctic Circle. So what kind of light conditions can they expect there?
Well, very, very low light, almost unnoticeable light, I think, just north of the Arctic Circle. For instance, Tromsø in Norway gets 24 hours of complete darkness, but come just a few hours south of there and you will notice a very low light in the sky.
And it's a special moment for people in the southern hemisphere as well, isn't it? Because actually it's the longest days there. Is it as significant in the southern hemisphere?
I think so, yes. I think we certainly like to celebrate the solstice, whether it's winter solstice or summer solstice, and also the equinoxes as well. All around the world, we celebrate those moments of change. It marks our seasonal change in weather and light, and certainly celebration for both summer and winter solstice.
And there are some strange anomalies, aren't there?
That's right. So as of the day after the solstice, in the northern hemisphere, the days will start to get longer. But you'd think that would mean that the sun would rise earlier and set later, but actually that's not the case. So over the next few weeks, the sun will still rise a little bit later, so the mornings will still be darker in the northern hemisphere, but the evenings will start to get lighter. It's not until January in the new year that we start to see sunrise also becoming earlier, as well as the sunset becoming later. So we've got a few weeks to wait.
Sarah Keith-Lucas from BBC Weather. It's almost 3 years since the massively successful musical Hamilton opened on stage in New York. It uses a multiracial cast to tell what might have been a rather dry story about Alexander Hamilton, America's first Treasury Secretary, who was born in the Caribbean in the 1750s. Hamilton has just had its opening night here in London, so will it be as big a hit outside America? Here's our arts correspondent, Vincent Dowd.
No one else was in the room where it happened, the room where it happened, the room where it happened. No one else was in the...
Victoria Palace Theatre is, for now, booking only until next summer. Doubtless, the producers will, within days, announce it's going to stay a lot longer. Though it's set during and after the American War of Independence, audiences in America have found the hugely energetic way the story's told says something about today. Already, it seems the same in London.
I was really enthralled and really moved, far more than I thought I would be by the whole thing.
I cried. That's how good it was.
It was talking about really big, but at the same time simple themes about ambition and love and what's really important in life. And I thought the characters were built into this beautiful arc by the end of it. I wish politics could be that fun in real life America. I mean, the rap battles and the variety of songs.
I think it's an incredible piece of writing. I think it's changing the face of theatre, and it's definitely done that in America, and I'm excited to see what it does in London.
Lin-Manuel Miranda, the 37-year-old creator, isn't in the London show as he was on Broadway, but he's been closely involved in choosing the London cast, which is talented and deliberately diverse.
We're going to use every tool at our disposal to eliminate the distance between a modern audience and something that happened 200 some odd years ago. The casting is part of that. This is a story of America then told by America now.
Few shows catch the moment the way Hamilton has. It's already become, like The Mikado or Porgy and Bess or Oklahoma or Hair, a classic. It's of its time, but it will stay with us for decades to come.
Vincent Dowd. And that's all from us for now, but an updated version of the Global News podcast will be available for you to download later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Nick Miles. Until next time, goodbye.